A German fighter ace shot down over enemy territory, but instead of rotting in a prison camp, he ended up flying their planes, testing the very aircraft designed to kill his former comrades. This is the story of the man who switched sides in the sky, and how his skills became the Allies' most valuable weapon against the Luftwaffe. Who was he? His name was Hans Werner Lurch, a Luftwaffe test pilot, one of Germany's best. By 1943, he'd logged over 1,000 hours in the cockpit, testing every fighter plane the Third Reich could build, Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, even experimental prototypes that never saw combat. He wasn't just good, he was precise, methodical, the kind of pilot who could push an aircraft to its absolute limit and bring it back in one piece. The Luftwaffe trusted him with their most advanced machines. He knew their strengths, their weaknesses, every technical secret hidden inside those engines. He was 31 years old, calm under pressure, a professional who did his job without the theatrics of the fighter aces. But Hans had one problem. He flew too close to the front lines, and in the spring of 1943, during a routine test flight near the French coast, his luck ran out. Allied fighters appeared on his tail, and within seconds, his plane was hit. The shot down. The mission was supposed to be simple. Test a modified Focke-Wulf 190, check the new engine settings, return to base. The sky over northern France was clear that morning, perfect visibility for miles. Hans climbed to 15,000 feet, running through his checklist, watching the gauges, feeling the plane respond to every input. Then the radio crackled, a warning, enemy aircraft, closing fast. He banked hard, saw them coming, 4 P-47 Thunderbolts diving from above. The first burst of gunfire tore through his left wing. Metal shredded. The controls went stiff. Another pass, more hits. The cockpit filled with smoke. Fire erupted from the engine cowling. He had seconds to decide, ride it down or jump. His hand found the canopy release. The wind screamed in. He rolled the plane inverted and dropped into the sky. The parachute opened with a violent jerk. He floated down toward enemy territory, watching his plane spiral into the French countryside and explode. Allied soldiers were waiting when he hit the ground, rifles pointed, hands zip, searched, stripped of everything. Hans Werner Lurch thought his war was over, but the Allies had other plans, and what they asked him to do next would shock even his own men. The interrogation. They didn't take him to a regular POW camp. No barbed wire, no crowded barracks. Instead, Hans found himself in a small room at a secret facility somewhere in southern England. Intelligence officers sat across from him, British, American, maps and photographs spread across the table. They asked questions, technical questions, about the FW-190, its performance envelope, engine specifications, armament. Hans stayed silent at first. He was a prisoner of war. He had rights. He gave them his name, rank, and serial number, nothing more. But then they showed him something that changed everything. Photographs, dozens of them. Captured German aircraft sitting in Allied hangars. Messerschmitt Bf-109s with RAF roundels painted over the crosses. Focke-Wulf 190s with American stars on the wings. Even a few experimental types he recognized from his own test flights at Rechlin. The officer leaned forward. "We have the planes," he said, "but we don't know how to fly them properly." Manuals were in German. Technical data was incomplete. Allied test pilots were trying, but they were crashing, dying. The aircraft were too unfamiliar, too dangerous. The officer slid a document across the table. "Fly for us. Teach us how these machines work. help us understand what we're facing." Hans stared at the paper. It wasn't an interrogation anymore. It was an offer, one that would make him either a traitor or a survivor. But what he didn't know was that this decision would save thousands of lives. The decision. Why would a German pilot help the enemy? The question kept him awake that first night. Hans wasn't a fanatic. He'd never joined the Nazi Party. To him, flying was science, engineering, not ideology. He tested planes because he was good at it, not because he believed in the cause. But still, this was different. This was betrayal, wasn't it? He thought about the war, how it was going. Stalingrad had fallen. The Allies were bombing German cities every night. The tide was turning, and everyone knew it, even if they didn't say it out loud. How many more would die before it ended? And there was another factor, a practical one. In a POW camp, he'd spend years behind wire, eating thin soup, waiting for a war to end. But if he cooperated, he would be treated well, fed, protected. He'd get to fly again. The moral calculation wasn't simple, but Hans made his choice. "I'll do it," he told them the next morning. Papers were signed, security protocols explained. He'd be watched constantly, guards assigned. Any attempt to escape would be met with force. They took him to a secret airfield in the English countryside. Hangars lined the runway. Inside, captured German aircraft, perfectly preserved, waiting. Mechanics and engineers stood in small groups, nervous, watching the German pilot walk toward them. An officer pointed to a familiar shape in the nearest hangar, a Messerschmitt Bf 109. "That's your first flight," the officer said. Hans walked toward it. His heart pounded. The same plane he'd flown 100 times, but as he climbed into the cockpit and settled into the seat, something felt
The
terribly
first
wrong.
test flight. The cockpit smelled different. Oil, British cigarettes, unfamiliar cleaning solvents. But the layout was the same. Controls in the right places, gauges familiar. Hans ran through the pre-flight checks from memory. Fuel mixture, trim tabs, magnetos. On the ground, Allied personnel watched through binoculars. Some hopeful, some skeptical. Would he really fly it, or was this an elaborate escape plan? Hans pressed the starter. The Daimler-Benz engine coughed once, twice, then roared to life. That distinctive sound, 12 cylinders firing in perfect sequence. He felt the vibration through the stick. Throttle forward, the plane rolled toward the runway. Tower gave him clearance. He turned into the wind. Full power. The 109 surged forward. Tail came up. Speed building. 60 knots. 80. 100. The wheels left the ground. He was flying again. But then something changed. The engine note shifted, a slight roughness. The temperature gauge climbed too fast. Hans felt it immediately. The fuel mixture was wrong. The Allies had reassembled the engine, but they'd made a mistake. A small one. But at altitude, small mistakes killed pilots. The engine coughed, sputtered. Power dropped. The nose dipped. He was 200 feet up. Not enough altitude to bail out. Options flashed through his mind. Crash it? Glide to a field? Turn back? Every eye on the ground was locked on that plane. Hans made his decision in half a second. He chopped the throttle, lowered the nose, aimed for the runway. The 109 came in fast. Too fast, but controllable. Wheels touched, the plane bounced once, then settled. He rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway. Hans climbed out. The ground crew sprinted toward him. He didn't run, didn't try to escape. Instead, he walked straight to the chief engineer and told him exactly what was wrong. Carburetor adjustment. 3 degrees off specification. That's when the Allies realized something. They hadn't just captured a pilot. They'd captured the key to winning the air war. The intelligence gold mine. Hans Werner Lerch became more than a test pilot. He became an intelligence asset, a technical encyclopedia. Every evening after flights, he sat in debriefing rooms answering questions for hours. Officers took notes. Stenographers typed every word. He explained Luftwaffe tactics in detail. How German fighters attacked bomber formations, the standard approach angles, preferred altitudes for engagement. He described communication protocols, radio procedures, the codes they used. He drew diagrams showing blind spots on every German aircraft. The Bf-109? Vulnerable from below and behind when turning right. The FW-190? Elevator control stiffened above 400 miles per hour. Small details, but details that saved lives. He demonstrated combat maneuvers in the air, showing Allied pilots exactly how German aces fought. The scissor maneuver, the split S, the high yo-yo. Not just how to do them, how to counter them. Intelligence reports marked top secret flowed to fighter squadrons across England. Pilots studied his notes before missions. Survival rates improved measurably. Hans was given a code name for security, his real identity buried in classified files. The work continued. Week after week, month after month, he flew captured FW-190s, Heinkel bombers, Junkers transports. Each flight generated reports. Each report went straight to Allied command. By late 1944, Hans had flown more captured German aircraft than any pilot in history. But the most dangerous test was still coming. Because the Germans had built something new, something revolutionary, something that would change aerial combat forever, and the Allies had just captured one. The jet age arrived.
The jet age arrived. The Messerschmitt Me-262 arrived at the base in early 1945, transported in pieces, reassembled carefully, guarded constantly. Hans saw it for the first time in a closed hangar. The swept wings, the twin turbojets slung underneath, the predatory stance. It looked like it came from the future. This wasn't a propeller plane with an engine bolted on. This was something completely different. No Allied pilot had jet experience. The technology was alien. Turbine engines worked on different principles, different thrust characteristics, different failure modes. The flight envelope was unknown. Landing speed? Over 130 miles per hour, faster than most fighters' cruising speed. One mistake and you were dead. The officers asked Hans if he could fly it. He'd never flown a jet either, but he'd studied the reports, read the technical manuals. "I'll try," he said. The briefing took 4 hours. Engineers explained every system: fuel flow, ignition sequence, emergency procedures. They walked him through startup 17 times. There was no room for error. The morning of the flight was cold. Gray clouds, wind gusting across the runway. Hans climbed into the cockpit. The instruments looked familiar but different. New gauges, new limits. He ran the checklist. Fuel pumps on, igniters armed, the starter button. The turbines wound up with a rising whine. Not the roar of a piston engine, something smoother, more powerful. The sound of tomorrow. Hans advanced the throttles. The plane rolled forward. No propeller torque, no engine vibration, just pure thrust pushing him back into the seat. He lined up on the runway. Full power. The acceleration was violent, instant, relentless. 100 knots in seconds. The nose lifted. He was airborne. Climbing faster than any plane he'd ever flown. 250 miles per hour, 300, 400. He leveled off at 10,000 feet. The jet handled beautifully, responsive, stable. For 90 seconds, everything was perfect. Then the left engine temperature gauge spiked into the red. Warning lights flashed across the panel. At 500 miles per hour and 10,000 feet, Hans had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision. Shut down the engine? Risk a single-engine landing at extreme speed? Or push through and hope it didn't explode? The altimeter unwound. 9,000 feet. 8,000. He pulled the throttle back on the left engine. The temperature stabilized. Barely. Single engine now. Less thrust, but controllable. He turned back toward the base. Lined up for landing. Too fast. Way too fast. The runway looked impossibly short. Wheels touched at 140 miles per hour. Brakes screaming. The end of the runway rushing closer. The Me-262 stopped with 50 feet of pavement left. Hans sat in the cockpit, heart pounding, hands shaking. He'd survived, and the intelligence he was about to deliver would prove the jet's fatal weakness. The legacy. Hans climbed out of that jet and wrote a 10-page report. Every flaw documented, every weakness identified. The Junkers Jumo 262 engines overheated under sustained combat power. Turbine blades failed after 25 hours of operation. Fuel consumption made the jet's range laughably short. The Me-262 was fast, deadly, revolutionary, but it was also fragile, unreliable, a maintenance nightmare. Allied engineers studied his notes obsessively. They developed tactics specifically to counter the jet threat. Attack during takeoff and landing, when the Me-262 was slow and vulnerable. Target the airfields. Destroy them on the ground. It worked. The Me-262 never changed the outcome of the war. Hans continued testing captured aircraft until Germany surrendered in May 1945. He flew 73 different German types. Each flight generated intelligence. Each report saved Allied lives. His contributions remained classified for decades, the full story hidden in locked files. After the war, his situation was complicated. He couldn't return to Germany, not immediately. Some would call him a traitor. Others would call him a pragmatist, a survivor. A man who made an impossible choice. The British protected his identity, gave him a new name, new papers. He lived quietly, worked as a civilian test pilot. The truth only emerged years later, when historians finally opened the classified files. Hans Werner Lerche had provided intelligence that helped shorten the air war. Estimated impact? Thousands of Allied lives saved. Maybe more. He never wore a uniform again, never flew in combat, never sought recognition. But the men who climbed into their fighters over Europe, the ones who came home to their families, They owed their lives to decisions made in those cockpits, to the intelligence provided by one of Germany's own, the German pilot who switched sides in the sky, proving that sometimes the line between enemy and ally depends entirely on which cockpit you're sitting in.